This is a little more technological. Okay, so here we are, everyone. And today we are fortunate to have Greg Evans, the illustrious translator and globe hopping traveler who goes between US and Prague quite frequently, to talk about the late, great science fiction writer, Josef Nesvadba. And he will probably talk about many other aspects of this international trade and in ideas and creativity. So he has many other credentials. He is the significant partner of Alice Whittenburg, who is the spirit of the local Tucson Peace Center and puts out our peace newsletter. Many of science fiction fandom are for peace. There's a big division in science fiction where you have some who are for militarism, but many people are and have been for peace, such as Isaac Asimov, who was a great friend of mine. And so I hope we'll get into some of these nuances that are often missed by the media characterizations of science fiction, which I don't want to go on at length, but they're highly misleading and they create quite a misguided picture of science fiction, what it has been, what it is, and what it can be. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to Greg.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and I just wanted to say before we got started that as we get started, that because I knew Josef Nesvadba, and also, of course, Gloria did too. And the way I sort of came upon that was that I first met Nesvadba in 1998 as I was preparing the web page for him, which I think I'll put a link in here for it, the Josef Nesvadba page, which is the official Nesvadba page, and so on. He worked with me on it, webpage. And when I first met him, he said, "Oh, where are you from?" And I said, "Arizona." And he said, "Oh, I know a couple in Tucson, and I've always meant to travel there." Well, I mean, 16, 17 years later, I finally met Gloria, and we established that we both, that she and her husband, that was the couple. And furthermore, I guess that the travel to Tucson had to do with his wanting to travel to Tucson, which, a lot of places travel in the United States. Why specifically Tucson? And that had to do apparently with he was a guest at the Tucson. He was.
Let me go. Could I interject? Yeah, I
Yes.
met him in 1978 and
Yes. Oh, I know.
1982. And yes, we were funding him to come to, it's called TUSCON, to the TUSCON, which just had its 50th anniversary.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, his wife, Libusha, got ill and he couldn't make the trip. And that was, I believe, in the 80s sometime.
Yeah.
I don't remember.
So that was the history. So, but just sort of give a brief sort of bio and so on of Josef Nesvadba. He was born in 1926 in Prague, as I recall it. And that, of course, is a historically important time, not 1926 per se, but that meant that by the time he was 12 years old, of course, you'd have the Munich Agreement, and then with the betrayal of the Czechoslovak Republic, and then by the time he was in high school, of course, you had the Nazi occupation of the protectorate of the Czechoslovakia, or what was left of it by that point. And then as he graduated from high school, goes on to college, or the immediate post-war period, then you've got the communist coup in 1948. And so, you couldn't really grow up in a much more historically impactful time. Although it must be said, of course, that he didn't have to go fight in any wars, that he had that advantage. I mean, and he wasn't Jewish, so he wasn't being trepped off to a camp or anything. So it was impactful, but not personally, a highly fraught time. He wasn't, because he didn't have to go to an army or anything and fight in one of the horrific battles. But still, nonetheless, so he was 22 when the communists took over, and just graduate, in college. And as he was, so basically, if we're going to talk about focus on his literary background, he starts to come of age under the communist government, and that is a somewhat interesting question that for us to deal with, because I think there's a lot of misinformation about the sort of literature and so on under communism, because there's a tendency to sort of see it as being like North Korea or something, or the height of Stalinism, that it's this, proletarian, heroic proletarian workers sort of, marching forward bravely into history. And there were periods like that. And when Nesvadba was very young, I think that was actually part of that was happening some in Czechoslovakia in the early 50s. But by the time he started really writing, and he started writing plays, primarily at first non-science fiction plays, by the mid 50s, there's a real reaction to that. There was a 1956 Writers' Congress in which, I think that was after Khrushchev's, secret speech, denunciation of Stalin. And there was the situation was really, there's a visceral reaction on the part of Czech writers, Czech communist writers, against the sort of Stalinist propaganda thing. And so Nesvadba was sort of coming of age in that environment, and that's pretty much where he spent most of his active writing career. Because while it changed variously over time, it nonetheless was really focused. That was sort of, but still there's similarities, and I'll explore those briefly momentarily. But so I wanted to sort of discuss a little bit that basically because much is made, for instance, of the communists, the censorship under communism and so on. And you have, for instance, I know that there's been much made out of, I'm thinking, there was a series of books of Stanislav Lem's science fiction recently published by MIT Press, and there were various introductions written for it and everything. And it's always striking when I read those introductions, the fact that they're speaking so strongly and so about the communist censor, and what a miracle it is that Lem got past these mysterious, all-powerful censors that were looming in the background. And I think that's a really sort of a major, that's one of the major misconceptions. I mean, there was definitely censorship. It was definitely an issue. And it was always an issue, but still it was a very complicated situation. First of all, there wasn't necessarily, at least as far as I understand it, some Communist Party ideologue in the back room, poring over every sentence to find an ideological deviancy. It was a little bit of a self-reinforcing system of publishers and so on, sort of, if you want to be a publisher, you knew what sort of could get past the censor and what couldn't, and so on. And so there's a little bit of a self-centering system. And I mean, again, it was very problematic in a lot of ways. But I think one of the reasons why we focus so much on the communist censor is because we want to sort of, I think in some ways, I think the communist censor is what I'm trying to say, in some ways was less dangerous in a certain kind of way than the marketplace censor. And that's that'd be a whole nother topic. But we live in because you knew that it was sort of there. You sort of knew what you could say, what you couldn't say. I mean, I remember Arnold Lustig, who, by the way, very famous author, well known in the United States. And Josef Nesvadba introduced me to Arnold Lustig, and I translated for Lustig too. And a very memorable Cafe Slavia. It was sort of a wonderful experience to meet Josef Nesvadba in the Cafe Slavia and to meet Arnold Lustig there. But Lustig one time told me that that really, in some ways, and of course, again, he was well published in the United States after he came here after 1968. And he said one time to me that that was really the best publishing situation, was like in the 1960s. He said, as long as you didn't say anything directly against Marxism, Leninism, you're okay, and you got a lot of backing, and you were celebrated in a kind of way. You weren't really trying to compete. And I think that all sort of helps set sort of a little bit of a stage, because again, at least you knew who your censor was, and it wasn't. And the dangerous thing about the West and our system is that there's a censorship out there in terms of the marketplace, and but it's like God or something. I mean, we don't really think about it. I mean, we just go about producing it. I can remember there was an article in the early 1990s in Science Fiction Studies in which an author discusses that, and she's discussing that, and there's even a phrase for it, writing to spec, where you just, and the authors were just accepting this sort of self-censorship, but they almost don't know it exists. It's just this thing. And I think that was an advantage of the communist censor, as opposed to the marketplace censor, was, even though it wasn't an ideologue in a back room, it was somebody that, yes, Eva,
Oh, you're muted.
you're muted.
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand. I mean, if you censor by the marketplaces, you don't get published. If you censor by the communist censor, you could go to prison or not publish at all. And there was quite a lot of censorship, but it was auto censorship because people were worried about the politics, so they didn't write about it. And it's interesting that science fiction and children's fiction, of course, was written much more. I think a lot of people wrote for children because that didn't have the danger of the censorship or doing something political. And of course, 1964, 63, before the Prague Spring, there was no censorship. That was very good. But before that, in the 50s, you could get into serious trouble if you wrote something mildly.
Well, I think that would be the sort of that'd be especially in the Stalinist period. And again, I'm not saying that if you wrote something that was extremely political, yes, that there was definitely that kind of
have to be
censorship.
extremely,
huh?
It didn't have to be extremely political. It was enough not to be sort of communist. There was always this sort of misinformation about history, certain things you couldn't write about. My family is Jewish, and we never learned about Jewish being in concentration camps, not even in the 60s. I went to school in 1959.
Like Romeo.
The communists, it was the communists who were in concentration camps. Nobody ever mentioned the Jews until the 60s when it started to be less censorship. And
But was it Olensak, Romeo Tamal?
Yes, but that was in the 60s. It was after 63, 64.
I think it was 56 or 57, as I recall. Olsenak? Yeah, Romeo Tamal. I'm not trying to.
No, it's possible, but I just think
Ladislav Fuchs. I'm just trying to think. I mean, I just saw an exhibit of Ladislav Fuchs at in Prague at the Obora Hviezda, and anyway, I got that, but yeah, I don't want. I'm trying to make a point that because again, my focus is mainly on science fiction here. I mean, you know, so I think the discussion about more mainstream literature would be another discussion. I'm sort of focused on the science fiction, and I'll try to show that, you know, in this course of time, and even after normalization, there was some, you know, latitude. And again, I think that my point was, again, with the politics, that it's a very specific, you know, that there's a kind of that there was a kind of latitude in terms of variations on a certain theme. And that's what I'm going to try to emphasize. Now, that theme was, broadly speaking, yes, it was within the communist ideological framework. That's true, and I'll try to show that. So maybe I'll be interested in your comment afterwards, you know, when I get done with all that. So, so anyway, yes, but I do think, and I do want to emphasize that I think that there is a marketplace censor, and I think that
Gloria has her hand up.
Oh, Gloria?
Yes, I want to answer Eva because I think many people I know from Czech, and I do know a number of people, or from East Germany, I think where we're talking in two directions, we're missing the point of each other. Yes, there was a more severe censorship, but as Greg says, you know, the genres here often get beyond marketplace censorship, and I do believe he's right that our marketplace censorship, if you starve someone, it's as bad as putting them in prison. They're in a prison of poverty. Don't forget that. I think I hear these very moralistic things, you know, coming out of ex-communist places. Oh, you might go to prison. Well, you could go to prison too here if you write about certain things. You know, there are things that can get you into big trouble. Not as much direct prison, but we have mass incarceration here of people of color who often have a different kind of prison. And we are an old colonialist culture built on slavery, which the Czechs were not, you know. So there are nuances and not completely commensurate situations. So it's hard to make these comparisons. How restrictive is it here? How restrictive is it there? Because there's more dimensions. And that's just what I wanted to say, to try to add that, you know, cubism, it's a multifaceted reality. It's not just we can take one factor and then compare it.
But if I make it, yeah, let me get back onto the sort of point I was trying to make was that, and I did want to try to say just as a further, because again, the question of the writing under communism and so on is a complicated one, and one of the examples I would come up with that I was going to use to help illustrate that the complication of it would be the question of journalism. A friend of mine, he was a journalist in his early years, and he went to journalism school at a communist, state university and everything, a state university under communism. And on one hand, he was saying, of course, as a journalist, you didn't learn about breaking stories or doing, finding a scandal or breaking a story or getting a source that you would then play to the press. That was very true. And on the other hand, it wasn't the brave proletarian facing forward in the future. The people that he read and that they were teaching him at his university was, for instance, John Steinbeck. His Travels with Charlie. In fact, I read Travels with Charlie by John Steinbeck. I read William Soroyan, and even Halliburton, the travel writer, American travel writer from the 1920s and 30s, because that's what they were reading. Because the idea was, of course, you don't break stories. You don't do a scandal from, of course, that would get you into trouble. That might, if you pursued it enough, that get you into prison. But the idea was there was an emphasis on writing well, presenting a kind of story, with some complexity and everything. So again, I was just really, when I was introducing that, I was trying to get away from the image that we have of this, that it was like North Korea or something. That's the main point I wanted to make right here. And the further question that comes up would be, there's a question of the reception in the West too. Of course, how is this, before we were discussing a little bit, the reception of like Czech science fiction or Eastern European science fiction in the West. Well, there's at that time there was a tremendous and that's the point that Nesvadba makes. There's always that they're always trying to find. There's always the assumption that every writer was writing against communism, that was their real agenda, that they didn't really have any concern, that they were just chafing under the oppression of communism and everything. And some of them were, to be sure. But many weren't. And Nesvadba would be, of course, a little bit in that category of, being a more complicated question. And this is from the interview that I translated, that André Neff, another science fiction writer from the communist era, that's actually very strident anti-communist, actually, was doing with Nesvadba in 1996. And Nesvadba says, this is in the 1960s when he first really started to become known as science fiction. At this time, they were sending translators to the East like spies, searching for talent. I read for the first time about the Strugatsky brothers in the German daily Der Zeit in an article by the editorial staff's criminologist. Erich Bertloff, a German translator from Czech, contacted me. He saw us as the standard bearers of unorthodox thinking. They took our work as political. Today, it is just the opposite. He's writing in the 1990s. Brian Stableford recently offered a story of mine to the American edition of Penthouse. They rejected it, saying it's too allegorical. And then he says that, goes on to say that Bertloff took Ostrov Piratu, that's a short story by Nesvadba, as a polemic with dogmatic communism. Everything that we wrote, they took that way, with the possible exception of Stanislav Lem, who they held to be largely theological because of Solaris. Science fiction wasn't a literature according to the Stanislavski method. It disturbed the Newtonian mechanical model of the world, the indeterminate nature of physical phenomenon. That was understood as political. That's what Nesvadba was saying. So, again, he was reacting to the tendency that everything, that everything was regarded being political, when some of it was, but they were concerned with other things too. And so I just want to give a brief. So in that sense, but nonetheless, he existed within this communist milieu, as I said, or he's writing in the background with that as his background, with disadvantages and advantages that presented. One of the advantages, though, well, I'll get to the advantages in a moment. So I've already discussed how there was a period of Stalinism. But then there was what was called a post-Stalinist period that lasted from about mid-50s until the Warsaw Pact invasion in 1968. And during that time, there was sort of sort of three different factions that were operating within the Communist Party. And again, that was the civic and political life was that of the Communist Party at that time. The sort of Václav Havel kind of dissidents that arose in the 1970s were not really a factor at that time. Because there was still a real belief in the Communist Party, or hope among many people that it would deliver on some of the promises, and that was basically the party apparatus, the technocrats, and what's called the radical Democrats or the Marxist humanists. Party apparatus, of course, was the higher ups, most of the higher ups in the Communist Party. They tended to rule. They're very ideological, traditional sort of Marxist-Leninist ideology. The technocrats were sort of were part of but sort of set against them were two sort of different dissident groups, and that was the technocrats, who believed very much in technocratic solutions, and then the radical Democrats were more humanist and were more for like worker control of factories and that kind of thing. And I'll discuss that much later. That's a very important point. Nesvadba was somewhere between probably the technocrats and the radical Democrats in his own approach. So that was sort of what was playing out during that time. And then, of course, the Warsaw Pact nations invaded, or the Soviet Union, the Red Army, and so on, sort of ended the 1960s party, the really neat situation that was going on with Prague Spring and everything. And there was a period called normalization that set in, which Nesvadba continued to write during. And I think that for him, I mean, it was a difficult period, but still, even during that period, there was still, the communist ideology was still sort of very present, although the radical Democrats were gone. They were really not a part of that. They totally, of course, they've been just were gone by that point. The technocrats were still there, and of course the party ideologues were very much in control. And but still, I think during that whole time, from the time he first really started writing science fiction in the mid-50s until the end of the 1980s and the Velvet Revolution, so on, there was a sense that communism was building towards a true the ideal at least was sort of building towards a true communism, a social societal communism, and the perception furthermore that science was a very important means to this end, a key means to this end. And that was true throughout the Eastern Bloc, and I think that's part of the reason why we get this golden age of science fiction that had Nesvadba, Stanislav Lem, Boris Arkadievich Strugatsky, Kirill Birukov, a Russian writer, a variety of people. And there are other Czech writers too that were interesting besides Nesvadba. And I think that was a very key, that sort of science approach, the belief in science, belief in science as a liberatory thing was very key. I mean, Nesvadba brought other elements as well, which we'll also look at. Not the least of which was, of course, human psychology, since he was, and I haven't mentioned this yet, of course, he was a working psychiatrist during this entire time, from mid-50s, early 50s, I think, graduating college until he retired in the early 90s. But still, and just as a quick sort of literary biography, continuation of that for Nesvadba, he was, as I've already mentioned, he started as a playwright in the mid-50s. By the late 50s, he was writing short stories, and then something quite phenomenal happened to him in the early 60s for a short story writer of science fiction. He became a sensation. He had 3 or 4 years where it was a sensation. They made a couple movies out of his stories. He was being selling copies all over the place. I mean, again, these are science fiction short stories, and he was a sensation, and he talked favorably of that time. And he continued to write, starting in the 70s, though. He started to write more longer works and more novels in the 80s, but he still continued to write some science fiction short stories, really, into at least into the early 90s. But still, it was especially that period, and that's what what I'm sort of focused on here is probably his first of all his short stories, not his novels, which were somewhat different, and also focusing on that, especially that period. I think of the stories, I think 3 of the 5 stories that's on the website that I put the link in over there are actually from that period. And then one is from his late period. But I as far as Nesvadba's actual writing is concerned and what he wrote and how he wrote, I'm going to quote here just as sort of introduction from the biography analysis that literary biography that I translated for the webpage by Ivan Adamovich, a science fiction critic. And he writes that Nesvadba's stories were in their time exceptional, not only in the framework of science fiction, but also in the realm of literature in general. Technology did not dominate these stories. Rather, these stories served as a laboratory examining morality, ethics, and philosophy. In the same way, both the characters and the plotline were only devices to be used to explore broader issues. The stories also give evidence of an intellectual interest in the possibilities of changing society. A cultivated style of writing, characterized by short sentences and a certain detachment in the unfolding events, is for Nesvadba's stories typical. And I would add to that, again, that there's various elements in Nesvadba's stories. There's, first of all, of course, psychology. Amongst the sort of, even talking about literary themes in his stories, you get to talk about psychology, and we could see that in actually 2 of the stories that I have on, and not just psychology, but his background as a psychiatrist, and they're on the website actually. The Half-Wit of Xenamuunde. Then the Half-Wit is, of course, how it was translated, but they're talking about really an autistic savant. And it's how this takes place during World War II. It takes place in a German occupied city, and this savant is a teenager, and he starts to develop advanced missile systems just because his father is working at this factory that the Germans are trying to do it. They can't succeed, but the autistic savant, he does, and the story plays out around that. And there's also Dr. Moreau's Other Island, which is also on the website. And in that case, he's sort of, it's a somewhat interesting, well, very interesting, but somewhat gripping, because he takes advantage of, because Dr. Moreau's Other Island also has mutilation and this sort of grotesque surgeries and so on that's going on, except in this case, they're voluntary towards a purpose that I'll leave it to you to read. But nonetheless, it's like a disease, as he describes it at the end. So again, and in both those stories, you get a real sense of Nesvadba, the working professional psychiatrist. But it's another slightly interesting theme that shows up in his short stories would be the sort of transportation anxiety. I think that Alice noticed at some point. You've got Mordare, which is a story that in which which is not on the website, in which there's a plane company that takes that operates sort of by consuming people. I mean, it's sort of like, they've somehow worked it so that instead of there being one accident every thousands of flights that kills everybody, every flight is a really big plane, one passenger dies, but they die sort of being consumed by, but it also fuels the flight somehow. So again, and then a very famous story that the film is based on, and that maybe even inspired some of the Christina and some of the ones that later came along, was Vampires Limited, about how people, the driving is this really fancy, great car, it sucks the blood out of them. So they're sort of, and yet they're choosing to die. They're choosing, so it means so much to them to drive this fancy car that they're some of them at least are willing to literally die, just to be able to have that at their command. And then I think also another theme that I've noticed in Nesvadba's writing would be the use of sort of older science fiction forms or types or inspirations. And that would be, of course, obviously I've mentioned The Other Island of Dr. Moreau. That's H.G. Wells, obviously, from H.G. Wells. And there's other stories too that are Wellsian in their approach. And I should mention that Nesvadba went to a English speaking high school, and I'm not sure how that worked. It'd been interesting to ask him, how because that was during the Nazi occupation. He was in high school. As far as I know, that was when he was going to this English speaking school. So that seems a little interesting. But nonetheless, because of that, he was very familiar with Wells, and not that Wells hadn't been translated, but still I gave him immediate access to Wells and Jules Verne. Well, I think one of his really great stories is the last adventure of Captain Nemo, which evokes, obviously, it's not about Captain Nemo, but it's about somebody who's like Captain Nemo and is, that has inspired, that they've named him Captain Nemo because he reminds them so much of the Verne's character and so on. And that's a story I can certainly recommend. And then also, Gloria?
You're muted.
You're muted.
That's one of my favorite Nesvadba stories because it's very feminist, I think, if it's the one I'm thinking of. It has a very, very strong pro-women. He was unusual in that period in that he really tried, I mean, as much as a man can do, to be cognizant that women aren't just little mini men or imitations of men, but they have their own strengths and their own genius, So that one, I think, shows that very well. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, actually, in this case, the interruption flowed perfectly because my next one that I was about to discuss was the role of women in Nesvadba's stories. And two of the stories that are on the website, actually, the Other Island of Dr. Moreau and also the Einstein Brain have women protagonists, women narrators, and that is, Gloria is absolutely right, that and they're completely normal. They're scientists. They're completely normal people, somewhat with feminine qualities, but still functioning very normally and everything. There's nothing. I mean, he is impressive. I mean, I think one of the introductions in that MIT series, which was an excellent series of Stanislaw Lem's books that have been reissued, it was a woman science, I forgot who it was, but a woman science fiction author, and she was talking about how misogynistic Lim was, and I was sort of surprised by that description because I was wondering, well, how would she know? Stanislaw, there simply really weren't women in Stanislaw Lem's works. I mean, and occasionally there was. I didn't perceive it as being anything particularly misogynistic, but they were just totally incidental. They were very much in the background. And so on, whereas Nesvadba put women, Gloria?
Could I put in a further note about that one story, The Last Voyage of Dr. Captain Nemo? It may be a bit of a spoiler, but I think it goes beyond what you said, because that could put him only at the level of Isaac Asimov, that women are normal, they're scientists, but otherwise, blah, blah, blah. No, it goes beyond that.
Yes, you're right.
That story actually denigrates the achievement, the masculinist, testosterone driven of the rocket jockey who expects to come back to huge crowds, but things have changed in his 100 years of being away.
Yeah.
And is it okay if I do a spoiler just fast?
Sure.
Spoiler here. Okay, well, this woman had a child who was developmentally disadvantaged in some way, but kind of a savant in music. And so while he was off blasting around the universe, this little wifey at home, like Penelope and Ulysses, she's taking care of the son. I don't remember the name. And it turns out he becomes the greatest composer on the planet. And so the father comes back waiting for the crowds. Where are the crowds? And there's this huge statue of his wife there, who is known as the mother who helped to create this great composer. She's the hero and not the space jockey going out to the planets. I went, whoa, this is different.
Actually, you're completely right. And I had overlooked that, but that you're right. That was a complete and you're right. That does go further than that, Bob. So yes, I think we've confirmed that with that insight. Definitely, that's unusual. Oh, Eva, did you have a? Oh, okay. Okay. So I think that so that does stand out. I suppose I should mention now, I don't know if it exactly has to do with that, but actually, speaking of famous children that in some ways may be more famous than their progenitor, Barbara, his daughter, Barbara, is actually like a best-selling author, a former editor of Cosmo, the Czech Cosmo. I mean, she's, now she's more of a sensational, best-selling sex and romance kind of novelist, but still she's actually she's quite famous actually in the Czech Republic. So I mentioned that. Now the last thing I wanted to talk about, and that's in terms of something substantial. Oh my goodness, it's getting late. That would be the to tie back in with the scientific technological the sort of communist emphasis that Nesvadba was operating under. And I partially do that because I just got a book when I was in Prague. It's called Revolutions for the Future, May 68 in the Prague Spring. I actually have a translation in it on another author writing about it, but it sort of it discusses the May-June Revolution in France and also the Prague Spring in Prague and everything. It's and one of the very interesting articles in it was an article that discussed exactly what I was talking about, and that's sort of the technocrats versus the radical Democrats, or you could also call them Marxist humanists. And I just wanted to read, and I just read this in the last few weeks, or this article, and it's like a whole new topic that somebody could write an article about or something, and that's because much of Nesvadba's fiction fits within this paradigm. And I'm going to read just a little bit. First, a description of the sort of the technocrat and what they were thinking. And again, everybody's operating under the communist thing. This is not technocrats as in Silicon Valley, who have a kind of libertarian socialist kind of, maybe at that time libertarian socialist, but then radical libertarian neoliberal once they started making some money kind of thing. And so this is just from that article. This is a description of what's called the STR, which means scientific technological revolution. These people declare in unison that due to self-operation, that means automation, human beings are emancipated from domination by machines and from exhausting labor. As soon as the human element is eliminated from the process of direct production, human beings are freed also from the remainder of functions that they have hitherto performed, since these are now delegated to automatic systems. In this manner, sufficient free time is opened up for human beings to broadly cultivate their productive capabilities and to realize themselves solely within creative domains, for example, as programmers of algorithms, as designers and constructors of machines, or as technological visionaries, etc. In brief, automation creates the preconditions for a leap into the realm of freedom, since the realm of necessity becomes the domain of machines, although it remains an appendage of humanity or its extended organs designed, constructed, and programmed by humans. And then, but arguing against automation were the radical Democrats, and here's the description of them. During the Prague Spring, a strong wave of criticism of the conception of the STR, scientific revolution, arose. The radical Democrats, as its foremost critics, rejected technological determinism. They deny the idea that the emancipation of humankind depends exclusively on the realization of the ideal of full automation, which, in their view, is perhaps necessary, though nevertheless surely not a sufficient condition of human emancipation. By contrast, they emphasize that there was no direct path leading from technological determinism to emancipation and democratic socialism. Rather, a direct path leads from technological determinism to technocracy. Accordingly, the synthesis of total humanism and technological determination also goes bankrupt, as it collapses due to the unrealizable claims of the STR. And again, the radical Democrats were, as I said, some of them were also Marxist humanists, were very much, we're trying to emphasize, of course, again, more the human qualities and so on. And that leads me to the opening page of the Einstein brain. And I think you can sort of see how Nesvadba was sort of between the two, and this is right starting from the beginning, and the Einstein brain. The situation is extremely grave. Professor Kozevkin brought his report to a close. During the lifetime of the last few generations, our progress in various technological fields has liberated mankind, freed mankind from drudgery, hunger, and war, and opened the way to the universe. I can still remember the time when the engineering faculties or universities had the pick of the finest students, and it was the heart's desire of every young man to study some branch of technical science. Look at things today. Our young people have lost interest in what we are doing. Physics, chemistry, and mathematics suddenly seem to have lost all interest for them. Every year, there are fewer and fewer students applying for entrance to our engineering faculty in alma mater. There's a danger that in a few years, we shall find ourselves obliged to restrict our research work and set limits to the number of staff we can employ. This state of affairs cannot be allowed to go on. Our machines cannot work without people to control them. They cannot take care of the needs of mankind unless there is someone to run them. Energetic steps must be taken. We all clapped, and Dr. Kozevkin sat down. At our university in Toronto, Professor Clark Smith-Jones took the floor. Things are almost worse. We have already had to shut down several of our specialized departments in certain aspects of space research, as well as a department of research into the nature of elementary particles, while students flock to hear lectures on Goethe and Herder's views on art. We've been forced to give up the gymnasium to the lecture in aesthetics, although when the university was founded, his department was almost forgotten. It was so insignificant. The shocking thing is that we cannot imagine how this state of affairs has come about. And then I'll skip ahead to where the, and this is the one of the women protagonists enters, the narrator of the story, there, who then, I decided to speak for myself after the previous speaker was done. There's no point in refusing to face facts. I got down to brass tacks at once. We've come to the end of our resources. We've reached a dead end. It is true that since the end of the 19th century, the technical sciences have transformed the world and thrown all other branches of knowledge into the shade. They have made it possible for humanity to devote itself to more important tasks and so on and so forth. We are all aware of these things, but technical progress has not solved the fundamental problems of the human mind. People are still asking how and why we should live, and we still know nothing of how the universe came into being, and we cannot understand the fourth dimension Einstein worked out. Whenever we set this question to our cybernetic machines, they reject it as unscientific and so on. And then she goes on to say how young people are now, more concerned with that kind of thing, and that we have to try to address that. And the Einstein brain is then an attempt on her part to sort of answer that question, and it's a long story, but how she does it. And I think, but still, that's one of the things that really sort of comes out, is that so many of his stories are sort of almost a back and forth on those two issues. And we can point to a story like Einstein's Brain, where it has a sort of an Epicurean ending that ends well. We can sort of Captain Nemo's Last Adventure is a case where a kind of automation and robotization led to what seems to be at the end actually a fairly happy, well-contented, very creative, dynamic society. On the other hand, we can point to the Storeroom of Lost Desire, which is also on it, in which that same sort of thing seems to have happened. The travelers come to a planet, and it seems to be very decadent. It's literally devolved, and seemingly it may have devolved because they didn't have to do anything productive and so on. And even that productivity kind of came up in the Marxist debates, because of course Marx himself emphasized the productive need of people. And so there's even debates back and forth between the radical Democrats and the technocrats about that and so on, how that plays out. So I think that's another, that'd be the last really important element of Nesvadba's fiction that I have found, at least. And as I said, just sort of recently came across it because of that article. And it's probably with some further investigation. If I was in graduate school and I was writing a doctoral dissertation on Nesvadba's works, I definitely focus on that. And then I just wanted to finish out by a quick discussion of his post-1989 career, or what happened. As I said, he turned to novels more in the 70s and 80s with fewer science fiction elements, although always sort of somewhere in between reality and sort of the fantastic. I think he did have one comment on, one thing that happened with science fiction in the 1990s that I could just relate on a personal level is sort of the radical Anglo-Americanization of Czech science fiction. I was partially drawn to go to the Czech Republic because there was this interesting science fiction scene, part of the whole Eastern European Soviet scene. And the Anglo-American scene, of course, having very interesting with the new wave in the early 70s, had become, to my mind, very commercial, very problematic. And I therefore was very unhappy when I read an article in 1996, Ikaria, which was the leading science fiction magazine, which they were admonishing Czech people writing in to not use English pseudonyms, use American and English pseudonyms for their names, because they organized it into, they had a Czech section and they had a world science fiction section. This is very confusing for us to put a Czech author into the, with an American name, Americanized name into the thing, because they're so focused on trying to sort of imitate this Anglo-American science fiction. And so that was an interesting side note. But I do want to read just one excerpt from the interview with Nesvadba, in which, of course, for him, as a leftist and so on, as a he's asked, did the collapse of the leftist dream, meaning communism in that case, traumatize you, ? And he answered, I don't know if traumatized is the right word. Nothing different really ever interested me. Already during the war, Karel Kosik, who, by the way, was one of the Marxist humanist radical Democrats, loaned me some Marxist works. Of course, then came the communist coup of 1948 and the intense pressures of the 1950s. But I always asked, how is it possible? How can we get there? A believer in the true sense of the word, I wasn't. Naturally, with a Marxist analysis, I agreed. In that, I wasn't alone. Fred Pohl, Donald Wollheim, and other American futurists saw things the same way. As to the rest, that was a true foundation of our intercourse, our friendship. The question is, has the destruction of the dream really come to pass? The times may have simply gone elsewhere, away from ideology, he wrote. And as I said, Nesvadba, this interview was from 1996. He died in 2005. He did come out with one more book, an interesting book, Peklo Beneshe, The Hell of Benesh, who was the president pre-World War II and then post-World War II president, and a foreign minister under Masaryk. And I just to finish out one last story, I mean, I can remember him, I was at his apartment just when that book came out. I think it was in 2002 or something. And he was, I was heartened in a way to see that this author, who was still quite famous, quite celebrated, he was calling around sort of angrily because the book didn't seem to be in the bookstores yet. He wanted it to hit the bookstores and everything. And he was sort of anxious about its reaction and how people would react to it and everything. And he also told me that, shows a little bit how the Czech public, he got paid a 30,000 crown, which is about $1,500 advance for the book. He said that was the same advance that he got in like 30 years earlier, for one of his books during, and of course it was probably worth 1/10 as much. But that he, he's still glad to be getting published, but still the print runs, that Peklo Benesh maybe had a print run of 1,000, a book, which would be a standard print run in the Czech Republic these days. A standard print run in the 60s or 70s might have been 50, 80, 100,000. So it's a very different situation. Anyway, then he died. I think he talked with me actually, he's going to invite Alice and me over for dinner when I talked with him in 2004, but then he died in sometime early 2005, and that was the end of the story, I guess. So so any questions or comments?
Well, I think you did an excellent overview, and certainly a lot of, even though I knew him pretty well personally, I just found a letter from him in one of the books that he gave me. Oh, by the way, I have all of these.
Wow. Wow.
They were all sent to us over the years, and they were all in Czech. So, I had to laboriously translate them. One of them, I don't know if you even know about. Let me just find it. It has pictures of his little girl, Barbara.
Oh, really?
Yeah, can you read the title here?
Yeah, what is that?
It says Židický průkaz rodičů.
Oh, yeah. That's.
Yeah. Could you say what that is? My Czech being a bit rusty, I don't want to miss it.
Driving license of the parents.
What is it?
Driving license of the parents.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So this is because he was an elderly father for the first time. And, he wasn't young when he had his daughter.
No.
So there are a lot of human sides to him that I think any discussion often has ideology foregrounded, and there was just a lot of human stuff. So but thank you so much for your overview, and your knowledge of him is much later than my firsthand meetings with him.
And Jim.
So I saw a middle-aged man. You saw him in the throes of his terminal illness.
Yeah.
And he was slowly going down with that. I wish he could be here to know that we did this, because he had so many setbacks with Arizona, not being able to come to the Tucson, and people then have forgotten him entirely in that organization. So
No, really? That's too bad.
yeah. Well, they've forgotten Isaac Asimov. Come on.
Oh, okay.
They've forgotten H.G. Wells. They have
Yeah.
20-year-old senility. What do we have now? The attention span of a mayfly?
Well, yeah, kind of, yeah.
Jim has a question.
Oh, Jim? Oh,
You're
You
muted,
muted.
Jim.
Sorry, very good. Well, I think that to Gloria's credit, and yours as well, Greg, what we've done is explore a major science fiction writer who grew up during the socialist formation of an important country in Eastern Europe, and to look at how a educated person from a country like that develops in the genre. And I think that because probably overwhelmingly fans, science fiction fans, are reading authors from capitalist countries. And so I think that
US only. Forget England.
Really?
Forget Turkey.
US.
Oh, no, we don't deal with them anymore. They're small franchises compared to us.
Well, personally, I'm a big fan of H.G. Wells, and of course, it's British, and really pre-technological era. I find that very interesting, how someone at the turn of the 20th century regards the future, what's to come. But I found that he was, first of all, very readable. I appreciate your posting some of his stories so that we didn't have to go somewhere else and read his stuff. And I did read the Idiot Bruno story, and found it very, very, very engaging and easy to read. So I'd say that if he was trying to be accessible to masses of readers, he did a good job of that. And I was curious, though, one story that you didn't put up there, and has my curiosity aroused, was this book called The Death of Tarzan. So may I ask, I don't know if you read it or not, maybe you haven't, Greg, but so is this talking about I guess Tarzan is sort of a story about settler colonialism, and it certainly emphasizes white supremacy in a way, and also if you can, Northern civilization, a centricity of global Northern civilization over a view of especially Central Africa, where Tarzan, this Lord Greystoke, we all know the story, becomes a huge leader in Africa. He even commands the animals, and all of the natives. So if you're familiar with that story, Greg, if you can tell us, what does that story involve? The death of Tarzan. What is he talking about there?
Well, actually, that's a very interesting question. It makes me very curious to read Smutter which is the Czech. I don't know if that was translated into English. I'll have to. I'm suddenly very curious to read it, but no, unfortunately, I haven't read it, so I couldn't. It was the title of one of his early collections. It got a lot of attention, but I don't know I couldn't answer your question. Eva, did you? Have you read it? Audio.
You muted.
There.
Well, I
You're-
read it such a long time ago that I can't
Yeah.
remember right, but it was partly in Nazi Germany, and it was about somebody who was in a circus, like a wild, shown in the circus as a Tarzan, as a wild person.
Hmm.
And then he comes back to normal society, has to learn how to live normally, not like a wild.
Oh, okay.
Well,
Very-
that's that's
Oh,
the
I
story.
remember.
That's the story of Tarzan that
Yeah.
you're relating.
I just love the film, so.
But
Gloria, okay.
anyway, I wanted to mention that Burroughs was one of those writers, and H.G. Wells as well.
Mhm.
Not only did they write science fiction, but they also wrote common prose, romances.
Wow.
Wells wrote some very, very powerful feminist revolution books as well. I can't remember. There's a story, Veronica something is one of his books about a young woman who becomes a feminist and talks about the suffragist movement in England at the time. So he wouldn't have been too unusual among other science fiction writers who was also writing just standard fiction, as well.
Yeah, Gloria,
Gloria, you're showing us the book?
Yeah, I'm showing a page of Tarzan, the death of Tarzan. I have this old battered copy of that story, but look at the artwork.
I know, it's
can you
beautiful.
see it?
Yes. It's
Yeah.
I don't know if you could see it, but this is the style of artwork in all of his works. It's very, very psychological, very surreal, and it's a lot like Max Ernst.
Mhm.
And Max Ernst did a lot of stuff very similar to this. And this came from a collection. It's all beaten up here. I have to keep moving in the wrong direction, which is funny because it's Vipravi Opachnim Smierem. Which way do I go here?
Opposite direction.
And Tarzanovi Smert is the first story in it. And I struggled, believe me. And I did translate it, although, the memory fades. And I think your synopsis that one of you gave is quite right. But there's an image in it that always stays with me from that story. And yeah, this is a woman's stomach and uterus. And anyway, there's an image in it. And it was that this bully character, whoever that was, in it, probably the Nazi blood and soil genetics kind of character, is beating himself like on the chest. He said, the Tarzan said, "Oh, I hadn't seen this kind of political formation, but it reminds me of the apes when they beat themselves on the chest." That's so funny how this person from outside of this ideological world, the first metaphor he came, yeah, that's a lot like the apes when they do this kind of thing, So it's great. It's really, and the art in this book knocked me over. I mean, here's another one. And again, I have to go in the opposite direction to
Yes.
get it to show.
There's the tradition of fine book
Yeah.
making in Czech Republic.
Yeah, and illustrators don't get their due either, to put in a word for the illustrator.
And every year
And,
they
but these are very good and they're very different. We wouldn't have illustrations like this in our science fiction. It's much too sketchy. We're in a very capitalist mode, and I can even speak to that, that everything has to be smooth. It has to look airbrushed. It has to look photoreal. This is so different. You couldn't sell these at a science fiction art show in the US. They go, what's that? What is that thing? I don't know what that is. Oops, throwing things around.
I think Alice has a
It would frustrate people, and they wouldn't, it has to be tied to a commercial product. It has to be, is this Harry Potter? No, that's not Harry Potter. Is that the latest of so-and-so series? Everything has to be tied to a specific franchise and a series of stories. And I want you to know that that is one of the biggest things that is completely, when I go to the Tuscan, that he would be lost if he went here because no one would relate to him. He isn't the latest series of one of the people that's constantly pumping their works. So there's no space for the external writer who doesn't fit one of these. It's like you're a square peg. We have all of our round holes. This one sells, this one is in this series, this one sells. And that may not put you in prison, but it will starve you. So
And he also
that
had,
kind of illustration wouldn't fly. It has to be it has to look like a colorful commercial calendar that used to hang on the wall with perfect photorealism. And it's way overcolored. It's very knock your eyes out, sugary colored, our science fiction illustration. Okay, I'm done.
I just wanted to add, and I'm sure that Eva could speak to this, there is a tradition of making beautiful books in the Czech Republic. And every year we've gone to many years, have seen, there will be an exhibition of the year's most beautiful books, illustrated and beautifully made and, with beautiful covers. So that is a tradition there to make beautiful
And
books.
I cannot understand how anybody would not want illustration like that.
I agree.
Oh, you should
I
see
also
our,
think that it's so difficult to get published generally. I mean, I've published a novel and it sank, I'm sure, but it was very, very difficult because nobody wants anything slightly different.
Mhm.
And I don't think my novel is a masterpiece, but I have seen bestsellers being chucked, 20 bestsellers in no quality whatsoever. So that's not part of it. And it must be frustrating for people who write well and can't get published.
it can be.
Yes.
could I say a fast word? Because Eva asked me if Ray Bradbury was an American. And again, he would not make it today. He would never make it because he wrote things that weren't just like a series and weren't totally like cornflakes. Now we're going to have Pop-Tarts. They all relate. He didn't do that. And he made it in an earlier period where this market mentality had not totally locked in the way we have it now. It's horrible.
I had one comment on the sort of market mentality because I was, having just been in Prague in September. One of the things I do is go through bookstores and I look carefully at books, what's come out since the last time I was there. And while the beautiful, the Krasna Kniha, the beautiful book tradition that Alice is referring to, you get to the mainstream, more literary works. There's still an effort. These publishers without much money, and they really do still make an effort periodically to, and so much more so than the American market. You can see, these very beautiful books, and the children's books are sometimes, there's a publisher called Baobab, which is like out of Tabor, and they just do these beautiful books, and so that tradition does survive, but not in science fiction. You go to the science fiction section and it's all Anglo-American style. It's maybe Czech authors, but there's the same kind of illustrations, it's the same covers and so on. And there's it doesn't. So it's an interesting, that as commercial as literature in general has gotten, the science fiction market, perhaps both here and certainly, I can certainly say, just based on that visual cue in the Czech Republic, is that much more commercial, because there's no beautiful books on the science fiction shelves. I mean,
Jim.
Oh, Jim?
I wanted to mention, I found it interesting, and to his credit, that in your interview with him, you asked him about allegory, I think it was, and he said, I don't care to write purely fantastical stories. That he wanted to create stories that had meaning, and that were social commentary. And he mentioned Tolkien in that regard. I think that he didn't feel that Tolkien, if it was allegorical, had enough allegory in it, then it was to be just a story of a land that no one knew, and a type, humanoid types and that kind of thing. I mean, that he didn't see any reason to write that kind of science fiction as well. I wanted also to mention that H.G. Wells wrote a 3-volume historical set of history called The Outline of History. And we were talking about illustrations in science fiction, and I thought it was interesting that I think it is Julian Huxley illustrated. There's a lot of illustrations in that work as well that Wells wrote, and I think that Julian is the son of Aldous Huxley, who I think was a contemporary of Wells' early life. And this I think he wrote this outline of history in the like 30s, maybe 40s. But I find it to be extremely there's some historical materialism in it, you know, the way he develops and talks about how the development of mankind, humankind, if you will. So just that mentions.
For me, Brave New World is the best science fiction novel I've ever read. That's I just think it's amazing. By Huxley.
Huxley, you think is the best?
Well, the Brave New World for me is my favorite science fiction novel. I think it's marvelous.
Which works of his do you especially like, Eva?
Brave New World. It's called Brave New World.
Oh, right, of course. Of course, one of the early and greatest dystopians, right?
Could I bring up the big influence on all Czech science fiction, because you're like leaving out the H.G. Wells of science fiction writing, and that is Karel Čapek. And here is his book, which is I got to do this way. This is the Winnie the Pooh of the Czech nation. Yay, that brave little terrier, Dashenka, Dasha for short. Now, you're coming into this from ground zero, but Karel Čapek was the one who originated and put into the world's languages the word robot.
Right, yes.
That is a Czech word, everybody. And that is the founder of Czech. Well, there were probably one precursor was Rabbi Löw and his golem. And he also inspired Frankenstein's creation. So you even have Čapek dealing with that and pulling up his robot out of the golem, and which is ambiguous, as is everything else. But everything is ambiguous. But Karel Čapek was a very brave writer who had no doubts about the coming of fascism, and he stood out. So he was like second on the list of those to be liquidated when the Nazis came in 1938. Number two, I don't know who
he died before they came. He died
He died of a heart attack, which I think probably was not unrelated to them coming and knowing that they were coming, because he had a weak heart. But he was not a weak personality, and he was very, very funny. And people think that when you're ideological or you're opposed to some formation that's coming in, you can't be funny. You can't. He was a gardener. He loved dogs. He had little terriers all the time. He wrote fairy tales for dogs. In Dashenka, there are fairy tales about little creatures. You should all read it. It's in English. That are wrote for his dog. So, this is a man who wasn't just there on the front lines, always thinking about. That is the biggest misinformation about all these countries, is that they don't have a well-rounded life like we do. They're always on this one issue. That's because our lenses focus on that one issue. We take them out of the 360 degrees that they live in, and we only look at them through this one thing. So Karel Čapek was famous as a travel writer, as a person who gardened very famously. And I love him. I absolutely love him. He's the love of my life, Karel Čapek. Poor man. And I think in the heart of every Czech, that not every Czech, there are people that they're always different. No national group is uniform. Don't misunderstand. But many people in the Czech Republic, he has a very special place. And I'm sure for Josef Nesvadba, he did. And if you read that man's life, it is so tragic, and yet he had a full life. Okay, and I'm sure Eva has some Karel Čapek thing she would like to say.
Well, I keep buying Karel Čapek books to my poor American friends who probably don't read them afterwards, but I can't resist it because he's just such a good writer, and they're in English translations, of course.
Yeah, and the three, here's like how I look at it. Maybe two. I'm trying to think who the third one was, but Kafka, he intersected with Karel Čapek. And if you read both Kafka and Karel Čapek, and it was a very humanist, trying to get over the anti-Semitism of Europe, period, where you can see, I even vacationed once where Kafka went. It was Spindlerhof Moline.
I'm going there in January.
Okay, and that was I'm getting it wrong. That was Franz Kafka's place where he went, and it's an amazing thing to see the fullness of how did these various strands interact. It's unfortunate for any country, you do get only ideological things or a few little high points, like, oh yes, that's Irish, they drink beer and they like the color green and they have St. Patrick's Day. End of story.
I heard
Right?
that.
We don't need to know anything more about them. They don't have 360 degrees lives like we do. We know these three things, that's enough.
But regarding Chopik, and I got a little, this will be a little bit of a discourse here. Because while I was in Prague, I bought a book from the Akademia bookstore on Václavské náměstí. You can see it's packaged.
That's what happens when you buy a book.
When you buy a book at this bookstore, it's a big bookstore. They carefully and lovingly wrap it in paper. And I haven't opened it since I got back. But what it is, and I should say it's a new edition of the War with the Blaka Similoki, War with the Newt.
Oh, the War with the Newts.
One of his famous.
I did a painting of that.
Amazing
Hold
book.
on. Wait.
And the War with the Newts, also, of course, the Maloki is kind of like the Czech version of the Hugo. That's the highest award. Well, I've got the new.
That's War with the Newts. That's Newts, it's called, my painting.
Yeah,
there you go. That's very much
It's a fantastic book.
It's such a beautiful edition. I couldn't resist buying it. I mean, everything about it's got the little newts are along the side of the book and on the top of the book, and then the get to the inner thing here. So just a beautiful.
Are these the original illustrations? I wonder, not this one, but the other ones on the cover, because they look like one of the.
No, it's just beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, the War with the Newts is one of the funniest novels ever written. Because the Newts take on all, and now we're in a period of re-validating nationalist stereotypes and national character, which was considered an obsolete 19th century idea. But now we're bringing it back, that this group is this and this group is that. So he makes fun of this, Karl Čapek does, in that he has the Newts who move to France all become Newts who are gourmet cooks, or what. They take on the national.
But now there, Jim, I don't know if you've read War with the
Dark
That's
part
very
as
interesting.
well. There is like a pre-Nazi vision.
Yes, the Aryan Newts are
the Newts are like they're just the little creatures out on a Pacific island, and then there's a whole bunch of cultural and some people try to say the Newts are like this primitive force, but they're not. They just become like us, and they become better than us at becoming like us, and they essentially cause humanity to become more or less extinct. I mean,
isn't that the same? It's sort of a variation on the robot. Because the robot,
yes, it is.
He's thinking of something that's protean and plastic, and it can change. And at first, it's really wonderful. Let's have more and more of them. And then, what did we do?
Is he a contemporary writer?
He died in 1938.
Yeah.
19th century.
He was a victim of the Nazi invasion of Prague. He was a victim of the Nazis. He had a heart attack, or he would have died in a concentration camp if he hadn't.
Like his brother Josef Nesvadba. His brother was a writer as well.
Yeah.
The book is called The Invasion of the Newt.
War with the
Newts.
War with the Newt.
Yes.
And
Newts,
what's his name?
C-H-E-K.
What?
C-H-E-K.
I just
I get it. Karel Čapek, I get it.
Yeah.
Karel
Čapek.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna look for that.
I just one
do. You'll love it.
Another interesting note about Čapek in terms of, because of course, as I said, the Maloki are that's the Czech Hugo. There's probably the biggest dedicated science fiction bookstore in Prague is Krakotit, named after another Chopik science fiction novel, except there's just one problem. I've been going to that bookstore for years, and it's named after a Chopik novel. Chopik, who's, another novel is the Czech Hugo. I've never seen a book by Karel Čapek in the bookstore named after named after his novel. It just drives you crazy. It drives you crazy.
Book. That's
Now, they have made a couple films. You can put in Czech film and put in his name, Karel Čapek. There are a couple films, and there are also theatrical,
he
RUR.
was a playwright. He was a very good playwright.
It's actually out there in play version on YouTube. You can see some groups have been doing RUR, and famously one did it during COVID. There's a new adaptation of RUR. Rossum's Universal Robots that introduced the word robot is by Karel Čapek, who died in 1938 of a heart attack before the Nazis marched in and would have put him in a concentration camp. So he was a very beloved person and had all these different hobbies, and
Well, he's also a high political person. He was
highly political,
very close friend and associate of Masaryk, Masaryk, the president. Very iconic figure himself. So
right.
So Eva, I was going to ask you, Eva. So you grew up in what was this? How did you, growing up? What was your?
I was born in 1953 when Stalin died, but but I lived in there until 1986 when I emigrated, and it was hardly worth it. And I wrote a book which is called Why Didn't They Leave? Which is basically a question: why don't people emigrate when there is time from different places? And in my family, whenever they did not emigrate, they made a mistake. 1938, 1948, 1968. But when I emigrated, it was hardly worth it because 1989 the communists left. So.
But when you're growing up, did you read Nesvadba?
Yeah.
Did you? Yeah.
Yes. Well, I mean, what was available. But yes, I read some. I didn't read that much science fiction. I read some, and I also read Ludvík Souček. That was he was very good too. I like that.
Yeah, he was a very popular science fiction, as I understand. He's very popular. Sort of wrote Eric von Däniken, sort of more straight science fiction.
About like the North, Iceland, and places like this. And it was such an exotic place for us. We couldn't travel, so it was interesting to read. But Karel Čapek, obviously, we read a lot.
Yeah.
But 1968, the Warsaw Pact invaded, and I was 15, and that's changed the politics completely.
Yes.
A lot of people emigrated, of course. A lot of Czech authors emigrated, and
when a lot of Czech authors couldn't publish, or it would be some years before they could publish again. I know. I mean, there's a much more limited. Again, as I understand it, affecting science fiction less because it was a more abstract thing, but still, it definitely had a serious impact on.
I would say it's more affected now by the taking over of the neutron star. Yeah, because you can't find Czech science fiction. It is a very pale imitation of U.S. And Karel Čapek must be, flipping in his grave.
But I don't think anybody would call him a science fiction author, although you're right, of course, he did write quite a lot of science fiction.
Yeah.
It was more the human bit.
But I mean, he is credited with the word robot, and you can't say he wasn't a science fiction writer.
But I think that could be better.
But in the Czech Republic, he's known as much broader. His gardening, his travel things, and
some of his other novels, like Horror and so on, he did write more mainstream.
Oh yeah, he wrote mainstream.
I was going to say, I think part of the thing though that ties with what Jim has been saying, like this rigid definition of science fiction as a genre. I mean, that really only started coming about in the 30s. I mean, I think before that, science fiction was, it was a way to write.
That was Hugo Gernsback.
But it wasn't this specific genre. And so Čapek, in that sense, Čapek was much more like H.G. Wells and Jules Verne before that, because they actually, they wrote, they were not tied in with the genre. I think it sort of started with Hugo Gernsback and amazing
Right,
science
the
fiction
pulps.
and the pulp magazines and so on. And it didn't really fully affect the because the communism, everything was running 20 years behind in many respects of communism, which was often a bad thing. Sometimes it was kind of a good thing. And in the case of science fiction, it didn't really hit until the 1990s. So even in the 1980s, although you had science fiction fans and you had some science, still, even then, science fiction was still actually a very excellent writer, Vladimir Parao,
Yes.
dominant.
I wouldn't call that science fiction either. Vladimir Parao somehow.
Yeah. Well, if you think
Science fiction to show something which is contemporary.
Yeah, although
Yes.
his one about Usti,
Partly.
Valkas Minoho Vitarovji, but it was more than, it wasn't just science fiction, but it's about how, because in a city worth multi-beast that was translated, but the smog over an industrial city gets so thick and so intense that it becomes a life form. And protagonists are having to deal with this smog life.
Bohemia looked like it. It was the brown hole. It was very much like that.
Yeah.
If you think about Wells, the Around the World in 80 Days and even Journey to the Center of the Earth, these were not technological science fiction works. They were as much adventures, so I think that there's a period in this technology boom where I think that it maybe inspired more writers to explore what this technology can mean, for society and the changes of society. Early in those days, the turn of the 20th century, there was not that kind of technological growth, I think, that stimulated the kind of science fiction that we regard today.
Did you have the illustration with Jules Verne, the original French ones, because they were so beautiful? All the Jules Verne books were illustrated with the original illustration in Czech.
Do you know where did he use Huxley? Oh no, that was Jules Verne. I forgot that. I wonder who illustrated his books.
It was a French illustrator, but the illustrations were beautiful.
French, huh? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, there are a couple things I'd like to bring up, both in the English and French, but also the adaptations in the Czech Republic. First of all, Jules Verne did not think much of H.G. Wells. He considered his science fiction to be scientific, and that Wells used too often a black box, like you'd say, well, they could read everybody's mind to explain why they understood the language. And he said, Wells depends on the black box, where I use the real science, which of course looks silly today, some of the things he did, but at the time it was current. Now, back to the Czech Republic, there is that famous film, The World of Jules Verne, and the Czechs are very famous for animation.
Yes,
they've got Karel, is it Karel Schwankmeyer? Jan
Schwankmeyer is the surrealist,
but then who did that? The old The World of Jules Verne. I can't remember who did it.
That was
you can find it on YouTube, by the way.
The famous animator. He was brilliant.
Brilliant animator.
Karel Zeman.
Yes, Karel Zeman. Yeah, Zeman, we would say Zeman. So I'm going to put this in the chat in case any of you want to go to YouTube and watch a great thing animated called The World of Jules Verne.
Yeah, Zeman was amazing animator, yeah. But again, no CGI, no definitely pre-digital, with all the advantages that brings. I mean,
it's a hard one.
But
may I just ask about, was there any mentioning, because there was a lot of very secret agents for the secret police among different people. Sometimes it was true. Sometimes the secret police actually had them in the letters, in the lists of agents when they were not. But there was definitely something about Josef Nesvadba when he was allegedly a secret police agent, and I just wonder whether it was true or whether they made it up to
They seem to, it's a little unclear. There's an article that, yeah, in I don't know, whether it's in Novinky or some Czech publication. There was an article that suggested that he was, seems to be some record of him. Very, it looks like he might have agreed
Yes.
to do something, but he was dropped so quickly. It suggests that he was of no value. I mean, that he, because what people would often do is to get back into, to get sort of back in with things and be able to start publishing. Because actually, it's come out that Egon Bondy, who is a leftist dissident, he had some kind of an agreement too, and yet he was very, and yet he never seemed to benefit from it, and it was, again, I think, a fairly brief thing. So probably,
Yeah, had a problem too, yes.
yeah, it's possible that Nesvadba for a couple of years, like 73, 74, sort of the height of normalization, may have agreed to something. Then what you do, as I understand, what you did was you fed him some gossip that everybody knew anyway, and after they dropped him after a year or two because he just was not giving them any information, but he'd sort of gotten back. So that's as I understand from what the article seemed to say. Yeah.
Yeah, and we do it too. There are people that go on Fulbrights and did, prior to 1990, and they go on Fulbrights to talk about, I know one in particular, Native American studies in Warsaw, and they could be low-level stringers looking at what's the gossip around Warsaw.
Mhm.
So, it goes both ways. And I think because Nesvadba was traveling to the US and he wanted to go to science fiction conferences, he might have signed something. Yeah, give me some news. Let me go to the Worldcon in Cleveland or whatever.
And he probably told them something they knew already, so.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
We had a friend who once at a party gave us all a little piece of paper which he typed and which said, "No, don't ever tell me anything."
Oh.
It was brave of him because one of us could have been as
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh.
So these are the nuances where and also we only hear about what they do. And I'm telling you, some of these Fulbrights weren't, and there's even a whole book called Hidden Hands about how we sponsored many of the abstract impressionist exhibitions in France. And because it was CIA money. So
Yes.
Well, those
it's
were the
well
days.
documented.
Those were the days when the opposition left, communists were so strong that the CIA was, the CIA was supporting socialist trade unions in France because their socialists were opposed to the communists. So they're supporting socialist trade unions.
Abstract expressionists.
Abstract expressionists, because they wanted to give this, because the Soviets were in a period of, extreme just socialist realism. And so they wanted to show, especially the French, France was a little bit of a, turning point in the 50s, was a little bit of a go either way kind of thing. And so they wanted to show the French intellectual class that, look, well, we got abstract expressionists and they've got their socialist realists. Who do you want? And a further point about that was actually the famous magazine, excellent magazine, leading literary magazine of its time, Partisan Review, in an American literary magazine in the 1950s and the 40s, 50s, and 60s and everything, which had a leftist orientation. It started out quite radical, but it was definitely leftist and everything. And this, again, they were like in financial trouble in 55 or 56, and then the CIA gave some money to this ersatz foundation that they have for the purposes, and they took out like 8,000 subscriptions or something to save the publication. And then of course they sent the issues to France to impress the French that, oh, look at our interesting literary scene, and we've got the socialist criticisms of American capitalism and everything, and yet this is a big publication. So yeah, in some ways I just regret, send some of that money this way, if we had more of an opposition, they'd be funneling at least progressive organizations instead of just funneling their money and so on into reactionary or,
Well,
I meant that ironically. I don't want any money from the CIA, but I meant that ironically, but still,
I think we understand and bring that up because it's more nuanced than what we get. We get fed a lot of pap all the time. It's 100% this, it's 100% that. And it's just pap, because when you know anything about culture, about literary art or visual art and the whole curatorship, now there's a book out called Curating Capitalism about how art no longer exists. It's a function of capitalist high finance and And the people that are going to be curators in the big exhibits, international exhibits and museums now go through the economics department, and that they are very macroeconomic. So, you know, there is no separation anymore. There's no degrees of separation between capitalism and art.
I think that was sort of the point I was trying to make, that Eva was questioning me on early on, first on, was, you know, not that communism, of course, had, you know, there was terrible periods and it was always a serious problem. But of course, there's advantages in knowing what I'm seeing happening with the marketplace and people's ideas and ideology and so on, is that they don't even know it's being itself, you know, that somehow that this, yeah, of course, if you're going to do art, you got to, you know, connect with the marketplace. You've got to do, but if you got to connect with the marketplace, then you're going to start self-censoring, but you don't even know you're self-censoring. It just becomes this automated reflex. Whereas on communism, with all, I mean, and again, I'm just, it was just to clarify something. I wasn't trying to say anything. It just, but so with communism, you knew who the censor was, you know, you knew what you knew.
And the self-censorship was so that the Czechs say, so that the wolf is full and the goat is still alive. That there was a lot of things, because if you do it in a clever way, you say something which can't be taken politically unless the censor, you could tell the censor, what do you mean? That's nothing to do with communism.
Can I inject one first one?
Knew what was going on, and there were still things getting through.
Yeah.
But I have a really good one. My husband saw it when we were in Prague. There's a big statue of a spring, like, you know, a metal spring from a bed or a car or something. And the title, if you look at the plate, it's called Prague Spring.
Oh. Oh.
Well, I think there is a self-censorship is enormous, and it's very powerful, especially in this country. There are certain things that newspapers just don't say. But I think that I think the advent of social media that gives individuals their own forum that we never had before, the ability to instantly critique, to present and critique newspaper articles, that before the information was all one way from top down, and they controlled the information world, because you couldn't reply except that it would be printed in their paper. You know, you get 1-2 column inches once a month. If they decide to print your letter, they have the ability to edit your letter as well. But with social media, we're free to build our own readership. I have 730 followers on Facebook, and you know, every day I read the New York Times and other publications and share those articles and present my views on them. So I think that we are pushing back on this, if you will, this bourgeois self-censorship that always has to be capitalist centered, and you know, and extolling the virtues of capitalism all the time. And I think that we are learning how to share ideas directly to build a, you know, even a huge consensus that we never could before, because this is a revolution in human communication. I think social media is.
You are more optimistic than I am.
I know there is that element. That, and I think that element, that belief that social media is pernicious, that it is a negative thing for society, that's pushed from the top. That's pushed from this top tier that wants to control the flow of information.
I don't think that's the reason. You've got a lot of people that do not have the guts to speak their life. And I say that as a woman at 80 who says that if I contributed anything to the world, it was that I failed. And hopefully some of those who come behind me will succeed. But we know how to stop the voices that need to be heard. and it's not being changed by the differences that the social media brings. The social media may bring it. I won't say the impossible. I sat on the front edge of the use of communication all my life. And so you're hearing my convictions that 20 years ago, I wouldn't have had the willingness to sit here and say these words. But at 80, what the hell?
That is true. That is true. I think that even on social media, and I see it, like I say, I've got 720 followers and 1,921 friends, and I'll publish something controversial and no one will even react. With all these people that I know are viewing it, no one even has the courage even to react.
Could I ask a little bit about Elaine? Because I don't know Elaine. I think maybe you've come to one of our Zooms before. Could you introduce yourself, Elaine? I'm glad you spoke up because everybody else I know.
Well, thank you, Gloria. I'm okay with being a shadow participant here because it's my pride and Evelyn's pride to have gotten Eva to come today, who is a friend we have met through our writing. There's a woman who creates a writing group called Women's Reading Aloud. And she's the mutual point that introduced us. Eva and I came to know each other through Goodreads when I was a shadow moderator on the Western Canon after I lost my husband and had disasters in the economics of the 1980s. I disappeared and had the luxury of being able to disappear into the world of being able to be a fun commentator many times on Goodreads. And I, like Eva, I've been an introverted reader all of my life. So that's it in a nutshell, Gloria.
Where are you? Where are you? You and Evelyn. I don't know where you're located. I mean, if
I'm in New Jersey.
You're in where?
I'm in New Jersey. Grew up in South Dakota.
Wow. Okay. And Evelyn too. I don't know where Evelyn is.
I'll explain. I love the Tucson Festival of Books. I'm from New Jersey. I was there the day that this discussion group was formed and passed around a manila pad, who wants to be part of it. And I haven't had a lot of time to participate, but I just love the connection. I love the idea of self-generation, And so I periodically would send notices of these meetings to Elaine. And when I saw today's topic, I sent it both to Elaine and to Eva.
Oh, wow. It's amazing. Yeah. Who knew? Who knew? I mean, I recognize.
Oh, nice. So it's lovely.
I knew you were one of our longtime readers of the list. I recognized your name. So if Elaine or Eva are not on our list, I would like to put you on our list, but I'll give you my email in the chat so you can request to be on our list. And, we aren't that big a group. We can use every person, so to speak.
I was thinking about the information because we were, of course, listening to Voice of America and Radio Britain, and that was illegal, but we were still listening to it because the local radio was 90s. But I had a lot of friends in East Berlin, and we used to visit. And what I noticed in East Berlin, when the bell rang at the door, nobody went to the door. Everybody went to their television and changed the antenna because the antenna was pointing to the West German television, to the West Berlin television. Before they opened the door, because it might be a policeman, they all went to the television, changed the antenna, then they opened the door. And that's just so.
So once again, if you want to join our listserv, it's sci-fi 200111@gmail.com. So it's 2001 and 2 extra ones. Sci-fi, SCIFI 200111
Hi, Jim.
gmail.com. And
Yeah.
I want to thank you, our speakers, for doing this. And this is one of the more networked across cultures and everything, time spans. And I think a window to show that, you know, some of what's going on, we're becoming so narrow. And you know, even in our local, you know, groups, I wouldn't say only the Tucson one, but we are focusing more and more on franchises and US writers. And of course, you do have to support your own writers, but it's becoming such an obsession that it seems that we're not getting the material from over in Europe, Asia. And that's, you know, why I'm bringing in people. And if I can get Africa and the Mideast and anywhere else, I'll bring them on too, because I think we need to hear from all the perspectives. That's an important thing. Oh, and by the way, I knew Josef Nesvadba because of Forey Ackerman, Mr. Sci-Fi, as he's known. He created that term. He was a Hollywood guy, and he was a big agent of many people, including Ray Bradbury in Hollywood, big collector of, he had the world's biggest science fiction materials museum at one point in his house. And Forey Ackerman knew Nesvadba. This was the period of high communism. He said, "Oh, you're going with your husband to Sweden? Here, when you go through, stop in Prague and make that one of your stops, and you can meet this science fiction writer, Jovial Joe." He called him Jovial Joe Nesvadba. And so that's how it was, through Forey Ackerman, Mr. Sci-Fi. And Forey went to Japan. He went to Japan, and they made him a national treasure because Forey Ackerman had been in World War II, like my father, who liberated 4 concentration camps in Patton's Third Army. And those people did not want another war. And so Forey made it his job, Cold War or no Cold War. He went to East Germany, he went to Poland, he went to various places, Japan, who'd been our enemy. And he was trying to be a goodwill ambassador via science fiction. This is something that most people who are not aware of the dimensions of science fiction do not know. And to the Japanese, probably to this day, they consider Forey Ackerman like a great treasure because he was one of the main ones promoting Godzilla in all these films they were putting out. So, and he had contacts like Nesvadba all over Europe and all over other countries. Thank you, Uncle Forey.
And thank you, Gloria, for
thanks for
organizing.
Oh, well, this is just fun, and it's like a wonder. It's just, I don't have any contact with the Nesvadba family. I don't know if you do. Do you have contact?
No, I don't. I think I
Lucia or
it'd be,
or
I don't know
Bara?
if his wife is still alive. It's
No, she
no,
died.
that wife, but the wife that I met, who was also a psychiatrist, as I recall, or
Yeah, that was his only wife, as far as I know.
Oh, really?
I mean, you know, at least the long-term one.
But
That's
she
the
was
mother
still,
of Barbara.
you said she was ill in the 1980s, but in that case, she was
had a
alive
kid
and well
with
when
it.
I met her. But that's, it's now 20 years ago since I last was in their household. So but his daughter, Bara, I mean, she was just, I mean, if you go on YouTube and just for Bara Nesvadba, she was on one TV program a month ago. She was on another TV program 3 months ago. She was on another TV. She was talking about, her father, just not as a writer, but as a psychiatrist. And
I have a funny story about her celebrity. I saw her in a picture that made it look like she was nude. When when the internet was first coming in and you could get images, and I typed her name, and she was posing some way, but it looked like she was nude. And I just wrote to Nesvadba. I said, "Oh, well, I saw the photo of Bara where she looked like she was nude, but I could tell it was." And he went, "What photo?"
A lot of time I was walking across the street, and there's a bookstore on the other side, and it was at night, and they had a big laminated, lit up sort of a sign, for a book, and it started as a quotation, I was in check and everything, about how, the first time I had sex, it was in the back seat of a Skoda, and something, and then by the time I crossed the street, I could say, "Oh, that's Dr. Nesvadba's daughter," right? right. Excerpt from her newest, Potboiler, sex pot novel. I mean, so
It was lucky. It could have been a Trabant.
It could have been.
we rode at Škodas, and they weren't bad cars, according to Bob. He said you could get in and you could see everything. It was a lot like the old Volkswagens, you could fix it yourself, and
Yeah.
it was very utilitarian. It didn't have any frills, but it was what it was.
Yes.
So unfortunately, again, the Škoda has gone away in terms of it being the pride of the Czech country, because I believe now it's a subsidiary of Volkswagen.
Yeah.
And that's okay, because everything's doing that now. But that was one of their little claims to fame. We have a car that's not too bad, and it's called a Škoda, which means shame or something.
I mean, damage. Škoda, it's a
Oh,
damage.
damn.
Yeah,
It's a funny name.
because it was originally the factory started out as a munitions manufacturer for the
This
Austro-Hungarian
was the
Empire.
name of the owner of the big factory.
Yeah, I
Yes,
thought
yeah.
it was the same.
That it didn't mean that the car are pity or damaged. It's just
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Škoda means pity. If you say
Oh, yeah.
Škoda, it means
or damage.
yeah.
Yeah, damage. Yeah, damage.
We have weird names because even Nesvadba is not a wedding.
Yeah,
So-
yeah.
Oh, yes, it
So
is. Yes,
we have
it
very
is.
funny surnames.
Oh yeah,
yes,
I
it
had
is.
one Bohemian grandfather. By the way, in Chicago, they never called themselves Czechs, the immigrants. They were Bohemians. So I'm like 1/4. And their name was Ptacek,
Little bit.
little bird. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Nice. I'd like to be a little bird.
Well, my surname is Hnízdo, which means nest.
Oh, does it?
So yeah.
Yeah, there you are. Yes, it does. I have a spotty language command of like Spanish, Swedish, German, and Czech. And sometimes I think of the words in the wrong language, but I think it also, again, I'd recommend to everybody, no matter what your age, learn a language, even if you can't do it very proficiently. It makes your brain create new neural passageways.
I'm trying to learn Czech, but it's impossible.
Oh, keep it up. You'll find it. You'll start. Yeah, I mean, I can at least read headlines and things in German.
Yes,
And
I
Well,
can.
actually,
I can
Alison-
too.
Jag kan tala på svenska and lite grann. I can speak Swedish a little bit. My late
Actually,
husband
Alice can speak Czech better than the majority of Americans that have been living in Prague for the last 20, 30 years.
But that's not saying.
But that's not saying much, but Alice can speak Czech better than they can, so. Because
Yeah, well, you certainly have a grasp of some of the major things, in the culture. And here's another bad thing that we do in the West. We only start the history of these places at the division of Warsaw Pact and in the West. These places were part of these other empires. I'm sorry, folks, like the Czechs were a big part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And before that, they resisted the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they have all these currents. The Bohemian came from a Celtish group, or Celtish, however we say it these days. And they weren't all Slavic. They were all mixed, mishmash. They were a real mutts. They were mutts. That's okay with me. And so all of this, I'm so proud of my whatever in Europe nationality is bogus, because all of these places were the sites of great migrations of people. Heck, the Celts were all the way in Budapest. The Varangian Norwegians, and they were all the way down to Istanbul. People don't know that, because I also,
And the
because my
Hungarians,
husband
of
was
course, came
Swedish.
from the east, so
Yeah.
that was
Yeah, and so they were all mingling, and
I always feel that there is nothing new, and I'm sort of annoyed by the fact that so many people think immigration is a problem, because people are always moving and
That's
usually
right.
brought some new things.
well, and you get ingrown if you don't get new gene pools. So, that's just too bad for the people that want to be pure. I mean, they take it very badly. People have a worldview based on belief rather than fact. And some people believe they're a pedigreed. I'm only this, I'm only that in my family. And everybody is, not only are we all the races, we're all made out of stardust too. So, I mean, specifically,
I know,
we're
Carl
all
Sagan
made
said that.
Stardust.
We are stars stuff.
True.
So I hope this raised some spirits, that there are other perspectives out there and ways to think of things. And next, now segue to the January. January, we have our old Tucson friend from the Tuscan group and my neighbor, he's a couple blocks away, Wolf Forrest, originally of Baltimore, who's a big fan of Edgar Allan Poe. And he's going to be speaking on Poe as a science fiction writer.
Huh?
And that's something that we have neglected. And see, it's just looking at him a different way. And there's every bit as much evidence to look at him and call him a science fiction writer as a horror writer.
Wow.
But, you know, we just don't, it's all in how you frame it, discourse framing. You know, we frame him as the horror writer. And anyway, so Wolf's already working on it. So,
Okay.
and he's going to come to here and we'll sit together in the room because he likes the setup here. So,
Oh, nice.
yeah, so I'm looking forward to it. He's going to do a big PowerPoint slideshow and everything. So I hope you all will join us. And this has gone on a bit, but it was so, we hate to cut it off because it was such an energetic and informative. Oh, one other thing, don't forget, you can go into, if you press the more button, at least on my computer, chat opens up. And there's 3 dots at the bottom. If you want all those references that people were giving in chat, click on the 3 dots, save chat, and it will go to your download folder. And you'll just find it in there under download. So
Okay.
thank you very much for coming.
Yeah,
and
thank you.
Thank
yeah.
you.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
having.
Nice
Yeah.
to
See you in
meet.
Nice to meet
January.
you.
Yes.
Nice to meet all of you,
Nice to
the
meet.
ones who are the new
Nasledno.
ones.
Yes.
Nasledno.
Naskladano.
Dobry.
Dobranoc.
Dobranoc. Dobranoc.
Dobranoc.
No.
Where you are.
Okay, we'll see
Bye.
you next time.
Bye.
Au revoir, reservoir.
Au revoir.